On a stormy night, my daughter desperately knocked on my door. She could barely speak, so I calmly brought her inside and covered her. And when she told me what her husband had done, I made a call that made him pay. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The wind howled like a wounded animal against my bedroom window, rattling the glass with such force I thought it might shatter. I'd lived in Minnesota for 66 years, weathered countless storms, but this one felt different. Angry, violent, the kind of blizzard that strips away pretenses and reveals what people are really made of. I was pulled from restless sleep by something that cut through the storm's fury. Desperate, frantic pounding on my front door. 3:20 in the morning, according to the red numbers glowing on my nightstand. My heart lurched. Nobody comes calling at this hour unless something terrible has happened. I grabbed my robe, my arthritic fingers fumbling with the belt as I hurried down the hallway. The pounding continued, urgent and pleading through the peephole. I could barely make out a figure hunched against the storm, but something about the silhouette made my blood run cold. "Maisie," I whispered, my hand trembling as I turned the deadbolt. The door flew open with the wind's help, and there stood my 34-year-old daughter, my baby girl, in a condition that will haunt me until my dying day. Her dark hair, usually so carefully styled, hung in frozen strands around her face. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking so violently she could barely stand. She wore nothing but a thin nightgown and a lightweight jacket that offered no protection against the sub-zero temperatures. "Mom," she managed through chattering teeth. And then she collapsed into my arms. I didn't ask questions. Not yet. I pulled her inside, locked the door against the storm, and immediately began stripping off her wet clothes. Her skin was ice cold, and I could see the early signs of frostbite on her fingertips. Terror gripped me as I realized how close I'd come to losing her. "Bath," I said, guiding her toward the bathroom. "We need to get you warm." I ran lukewarm water, not hot, because that could cause more damage, and helped her into the tub. She was still shaking, still unable to speak coherently. I wrapped towels around her shoulders and held her hands in mine, rubbing circulation back into those precious fingers that used to play piano so beautifully. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, though my own voice was shaking. "You're safe now. You're home." Home, the word felt loaded with meaning I didn't yet understand. Maisie lived 40 miles away with Derek, her husband of 8 years. They had a beautiful house in the suburbs, new cars, successful careers. What was she doing at my door in the middle of a blizzard, dressed like she'd fled for her life? After 20 minutes in the warm water, the color began returning to her cheeks. I helped her into my warmest pajamas and my thick winter robe, then settled her on the couch with hot tea and every blanket I owned. The storm still raged outside, but inside my small living room, we sat in the lamplight and finally she began to speak. "He left me there, Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He actually left me there." "Who left you where, honey?" "Derek." The name came out like something bitter she needed to spit out. "He drove me to that rest stop on Highway 52. You know the one. It's been closed for years. He told me to get out of the car." And when I asked why, he said he needed to teach me a lesson about respect. My hands tightened around my own tea mug. Derek had always seemed so charming, so devoted to Maisie. At family gatherings, he'd bring her flowers, pull out her chair, speak to her with such apparent affection. But something cold was settling in my stomach. I thought he was joking at first, she continued, tears starting to fall. But he was serious. He told me I could walk home if I wanted to learn what real hardship felt like. Then he drove away. In this storm, I could barely keep my voice level. "He left you outside in this weather." She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I waited for him to come back. I stood there for almost an hour, thinking he'd turn around, but he didn't, Mom. He really meant to leave me there. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was white-hot and clean, burning away any doubt about Derek's character. You don't abandon someone you love in a blizzard. You don't use winter weather as a weapon. This wasn't a moment of anger or poor judgment. This was calculated cruelty. "How did you get here?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. I walked to the highway and flagged down a trucker. He was heading this direction anyway, and he felt sorry for me. She laughed bitterly. A complete stranger showed me more kindness than my own husband. I pulled her closer, and she leaned into me the way she used to when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. But this storm wasn't weather. It was the man she'd married, the man I'd welcomed into our family, the man who'd just revealed himself to be something monstrous. "Did something happen before this?" I asked gently. "Did you two have a fight?" Her silence stretched so long I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and ashamed. "I found something, Mom. I found bank statements Derek had hidden. He's been taking money from our accounts. A lot of money." When I confronted him about it, he got furious. He said I had no right to question his decisions, that I was just a stupid woman who didn't understand finances. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that made me sick. "How much money, sweetheart?" "Everything." The word broke as she said it. "Our savings, my inheritance from Grandma Ruth, even the emergency fund we'd built up. It's all gone. 37,000 just gone." I felt something inside me shift and harden. Derek hadn't just abandoned my daughter in a blizzard. He'd stolen from her first. He'd taken her security, her trust, her safety, and then literally left her out in the cold when she dared to question him. Where do you think the money went? I don't know. The statements just show transfers to accounts I've never seen before. When I asked him about it, that's when he exploded. He said if I couldn't trust him, maybe I didn't deserve to know where our money was going. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to weaken, Maisie fell asleep curled up on my couch. I sat watching her. This woman who was still my little girl, and I made a promise to myself and to her. Derek thought he could destroy my daughter and walk away unscathed. He thought he could take everything from her and face no consequences. He had no idea what he'd just awakened in me. 3 days passed before Maisie felt strong enough to talk about returning to her house. 3 days of her jumping every time the phone rang. 3 days of watching her stare out my kitchen window like she was expecting Derek to come roaring up the driveway. But he never called. He never came. It was as if he'd erased her from his life as easily as he'd erased their bank accounts. On Thursday morning, I found her sitting at my kitchen table, still in my old robe, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The bruises under her eyes had faded, but something deeper remained broken. "I need to go back," she said without looking up. "I need to get my things, figure out what's left. I'll come with you." "Mom, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." I sat down across from her, covering her hands with mine. "You're not facing this alone." The drive to Maisie's house felt like traveling to a crime scene. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Perfect lawns, expensive cars, the kind of suburban paradise that promised safety and happiness. But I knew now that appearances could be the cruelest lies of all. Derek's BMW wasn't in the driveway. The house stood empty, looking almost abandoned despite its manicured exterior. Maisie's hands shook as she unlocked the front door. "He changed the alarm code," she said, punching in numbers that no longer worked, even the alarm code. Inside the house felt hollow. It was still clean, still decorated with the expensive furniture and artwork they'd collected together, but it felt stripped of life like a museum exhibit of a marriage that had never really existed. "I'll pack some clothes first," Maisie said, heading toward the stairs. "Then we can figure out the important documents." But 20 minutes later, she called my name from upstairs, and something in her voice made me run. I found her standing in what used to be their home office, holding a manila folder with trembling hands. "Mom," she whispered, "you need to see this." The folder contained bank statements, but not the ones Maisie had already found. These were for accounts she'd never known existed. Accounts with Derek's name and someone else's name, a woman named Patricia Hendress. "Who is Patricia Hriss?" I asked, though a sick feeling was already growing in my stomach. Maisie was flipping through pages, her face growing paler with each one. "I don't know, but look at these deposits. Regular deposits going back 2 years. And look at this address." She pointed to a billing address in Wisconsin. The amounts were staggering. Deposits of $3,000, $5,000, sometimes $7,000, all going into an account that Derek shared with this mystery woman. "There's more," Maisie said, opening a second folder. "Look at this. Credit card statements, but not for cards Maisie had ever seen. Charges for jewelry, expensive dinners, hotels, flights to exotic locations. A whole life Derek had been living in secret, funded by money he'd stolen from his wife. But the worst discovery was at the bottom of the pile. A real estate document for a house in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Purchased 18 months ago. Purchased by Derek Matthews and Patricia Hendress. He bought a house with her, Maisie said, her voice hollow. With my inheritance money, with our savings. He bought another woman a house. I felt rage building in me like pressure in a boiler. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't just adultery. This was a systematic destruction of my daughter's life, planned and executed over years, while he smiled at family dinners and played the devoted husband. "Maisie, sweetheart, we need to keep looking. If there's this much, there might be more." She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks, and we continued searching. What we found painted a picture of betrayal so complete, it took my breath away. Derek had been forging Maisie's signature on documents for months. Loan applications, credit line, increases, even a second mortgage on their house that Maisie knew nothing about. He'd used her excellent credit score to secure loans, then funneled that money to his secret accounts. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a handwritten note tucked inside a checkbook for an account Maisie had never seen. In Derek's distinctive scroll, it read, "M suspects something, need to accelerate timeline. P says she's ready to make it official." "He was planning to leave you," I said, reading the note again. "This whole thing was planned. The money, the house, even what happened the other night. It was all part of getting rid of you." Maisie sank into Derek's leather desk chair, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. "How long, Mom? How long was he lying to me?" I looked through the dates on the documents, my heart breaking for her with each revelation. "At least 2 years, honey. Maybe longer. 2 years of coming home to me every night. 2 years of telling me he loved me. 2 years of making love to me while he was planning to destroy my life. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Derek hadn't just cheated. He'd systematically robbed Maisie while making her believe she was loved and secure. He'd used her trust as a weapon against her. "There's something else," I said, pulling out a folder labeled insurance. "He changed the beneficiary on your life insurance policy. It's not you anymore, Maisie. It's Patricia Hriss." The silence in that room was deafening. My daughter, my beautiful, trusting daughter, had been married to a man who'd not only stolen her present, but had apparently planned for her future or lack thereof. "Mom," she said, finally, her voice eerily calm. "If happened to me that night in the storm, I couldn't finish that thought. Couldn't let myself imagine what might have happened if that trucker hadn't come along. If Maisie had been left to face the blizzard alone, had Derek hoped the cold would solve his problems permanently. But you're here," I said firmly. "You're alive, and now we know the truth. What am I supposed to do with this?" She gestured at the papers scattered across the desk. "How do I fight someone who's been this calculating, this thorough?" I looked at my daughter sitting in the wreckage of her marriage, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so complete it seemed impossible to overcome. But something was stirring in me, something that had been quiet for too many years. Derek thought he was so clever. He thought he'd covered all his bases, planned for every contingency, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what a mother would do to protect her child. As we packed up all the evidence we'd found, I was already making plans. Derek had no idea that his carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down around him. Back at my house that evening, I couldn't sleep. Maisie had finally fallen into an exhausted slumber on the couch, clutching a photo of her and Derek from their wedding day. 8 years ago, she'd looked so radiant, so full of hope. Now I wanted to burn that picture and everything it represented. I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents we'd found, spreading them out like pieces of a puzzle. There had to be more to this story. Men like Derek didn't just wake up one day and decide to destroy their wives' lives. This level of calculation, this systematic approach, it suggested experience. At 2 a.m, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my brother-in-law, Frank. He'd retired from the police force 5 years ago, but he still had connections, still knew how to dig up information that ordinary people couldn't access. Glenda. His voice was groggy but instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "Frank, I need your help. It's about Maisie." 20 minutes later, he was sitting in my kitchen examining the documents with the same methodical attention he'd once brought to crime scenes. Frank had always been thorough patient, the kind of man who believed that truth had a way of surfacing if you knew where to look. "This is sophisticated," he said, after studying Derek's financial maneuvers, the forged signatures, the multiple accounts, the property purchase. "This isn't amateur hour. Your son-in-law has done this before." "What do you mean?" Frank pulled out his laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising speed for a man in his 70s. "Patricia Hendris, right? Let me see what I can find about her." What he found made my blood run cold. Patricia Hriss wasn't Derek's first victim. She was his accomplice. "Look at this," Frank said, turning the screen toward me. Patricia Hriss, 42 years old, divorced. But here's the interesting part. She was married to a man named Robert Hriss until 3 years ago. According to court records, Robert accused her of systematically draining their joint accounts and forging his signature on loan documents. My hands began to shake. "Are you saying I'm saying your daughter married a professional con artist who's working with another professional con artist, and Maisie isn't their first victim?" Frank continued typing, pulling up more records. Robert Hriss lost everything: his house, his savings, his business. The divorce was nasty, and he tried to press criminal charges, but Patricia had covered her tracks too well. She disappeared right after the divorce was finalized. And then she found Derek, or Derek found her. Either way, they've been working together for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Frank's expression was grim. "Glenda, I think Derek specifically targeted Maisie. Look at the timeline. He met her right after she inherited that money from your mother, didn't he?" The realization hit me like a physical blow. He never loved her at all. It was always about the money and the house and her credit score and anything else he could steal. Frank closed the laptop and looked at me with the same intensity he'd once reserved for suspects. "There's more. I found records showing Derek Matthews isn't even his real name." The room seemed to spin around me. What? His real name is David Thornton. He's got a history. Glenda fraud charges in Illinois that were dropped on a technicality. A bankruptcy in Ohio where he somehow managed to hide assets. And there's a woman in Nevada who filed a restraining order against him 2 years before he met Maisie. I thought about my daughter sleeping in the next room. My trusting, loving daughter who'd spent 8 years married to a complete stranger. A man who'd never existed except as a carefully constructed lie designed to rob her blind. What about the house in Wisconsin, I asked. The one he bought with Patricia. Frank was already pulling up real estate records, purchased for $450,000 cash. Down payment of $180,000, which, if I'm reading these bank statements correctly, came directly from Maisie's inheritance. My mother's money, I whispered. Mom saved every penny for 50 years to leave something for her granddaughter, and he gave it to his partner in crime. There's more. The house isn't just where they're living, it's where they're planning their next move. I found utility records showing they've been there for over a year. Derek's been commuting back and forth, living two completely separate lives. The scope of the deception was staggering. While Maisie was working her job planning their future, believing in their marriage, Derek was building an entirely different life with another woman. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every weekend, he claimed to be visiting his sick aunt. All lies. Frank, what about the life insurance policy, the one where he changed the beneficiary to Patricia? His face darkened. That's the part that worries me most, combined with leaving Maisie in a blizzard. I think they were hoping she wouldn't survive that night. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. My daughter hadn't just been abandoned in a storm. She'd been left to die. We have to stop them, I said, my voice barely audible. They can't be allowed to do this to anyone else. Frank nodded slowly. The good news is they've gotten sloppy. All these documents, all this evidence. Derek must have thought Maisie would never find them. Or maybe he didn't care because he thought she'd be dead. What can we do? First, we document everything. Every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every lie. Then we trace where all that money went, and we figure out what their next move is. Frank's cop instincts were fully engaged now. But Glenda, we need to be careful. These people are dangerous, and they have nothing left to lose. As dawn broke outside my kitchen window, I realized that Derek's betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined. He hadn't just broken my daughter's heart. He'd built his entire relationship with her on a foundation of lies and theft. Every kiss, every anniversary, every moment of intimacy had been part of an elaborate con game. But Derek had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Maisie was alone, that she had no one who would fight for her. He'd forgotten that she had a mother who'd spent 66 years learning how to protect the people she loved. And now that I knew exactly who Derek really was and what he'd done, I was going to make sure he paid for every single lie he'd told, every dollar he'd stolen, and every tear my daughter had shed. The war was just beginning, and Derek had no idea what he was up against. Frank left my house at sunrise with a promise to make some calls. He knew people, he said, investigators, lawyers, contacts who could help us build a case that would stick. But as I watched his taillights disappear down my street, I realized there was one call I needed to make myself. After checking that Maisie was still sleeping, I went to my bedroom and pulled out an old phone book from my nightstand drawer. The pages were yellowed and worn, but I found the number I was looking for, a number I hadn't dialed in almost 20 years. Marcus Webb Investigations. Just hearing his voice took me back 30 years to a time when I was a different woman with different problems. But Marcus had solved those problems then, and I was betting he could solve these problems now. Marcus, it's Glenda Hoffman. The pause that followed stretched so long, I thought the line had gone dead. When he finally spoke, his voice was warm but surprised. Glenda. After all these years, I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again. I need your help, Marcus. It's about my daughter. Where do you want to meet that afternoon? I sat across from Marcus in a small cafe downtown, studying the man who'd once been much more than just a private investigator to me. At 72, he was still sharp, still had those intense gray eyes that seemed to see through everything. The years had been kind to him, even if life hadn't always been. "Tell me about Derek," he said, after I'd explained the basic situation. I spread the documents across the small table between us, watching his expression grow more serious with each revelation. When I told him about Derek's real identity, about Patricia, about the systematic theft, he let out a low whistle. "David Thornton," he said, making notes in a small notebook. "I remember that name. The Illinois case, right?" He walked away from fraud charges because his victim refused to testify. Why would she refuse? Marcus's expression darkened. Because she was scared. Thornton has a way of making people disappear when they become inconvenient. The woman in Nevada who filed the restraining order, she moved across the country and changed her name after he violated it twice. My stomach clenched. "Are you saying Maisie is in danger?" "I'm saying Thornton is more dangerous than your average con man. He doesn't just steal money, he destroys lives. And if he thinks Maisie can identify him or expose his operation, he'll do whatever it takes to stop her." I thought about my daughter, still fragile from her ordeal, still jumping at every unexpected sound. She had no idea how much danger she was really in. "What can we do?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "We have advantages Thornton doesn't know about. He thinks Maisie is isolated and helpless. He has no idea she has a mother with connections, or that those connections include someone who's been tracking financial criminals for 40 years. You can help her. I can do more than help her. I can destroy him." His voice carried the same quiet intensity I remembered from decades ago. "But we need to be smart about this. If we move too fast, he'll disappear like smoke, and you'll never see that money again." Marcus opened his laptop and began pulling up databases I'd never heard of. His fingers moved across the keyboard, with practiced efficiency, calling up records, cross-referencing names, building a picture of Derek's criminal enterprise. "Here's what I found so far," he said, turning the screen toward me. "David Thornton has been using the Derek Matthews identity for 5 years. Before that, he was Michael Davidson in Colorado, where he built a 60-year-old widow out of her late husband's pension. Before that, he was Daniel Morrison in Texas, where he convinced a recently divorced woman to give him power of attorney over her assets. The pattern was horrifying. How many women has he destroyed? At least 6 that I can confirm. Probably more." Marcus scrolled through his notes. "And Patricia Hendris isn't just his accomplice. She's his teacher. She's been running these cons for 15 years. And she's the one who taught him how to forge documents, how to manipulate women, how to disappear when things get hot. They're partners. More than that, they're married legally. Married under their real names in Wisconsin, which means Derek's marriage to Maisie is bigamy, a federal crime. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a surge of hope. That's something we can prove. It's something we can use," Marcus corrected. "But we need to be strategic. If we just turn this over to the police, Thornton and Hicks will lawyer up. Claim the forged signatures are fake. Say Maisie gave them permission to use the money. Without Maisie's testimony, it becomes a he said she said situation. What do you suggest?" Marcus closed the laptop and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We make them think they've won. We let them believe Maisie is broken, that she's not going to fight them. Then when they get careless, we spring the trap. What kind of trap? The kind that uses their greed against them. I've seen their financial records, Glenda. They're not just spending Maisie's money, they're spending it faster than they stole it. That house in Wisconsin, they're already behind on payments. They need another score, another victim." I began to understand where he was going with this. "You want to give them one. I want to give them the biggest score of their lives. Something so tempting they'll take risks, make mistakes, expose themselves completely." His smile was cold and predatory, and I know exactly how to do it. Marcus explained his plan in careful detail. It was audacious, dangerous, and absolutely brilliant. We would use Derek's greed and Patricia's arrogance to lure them into a situation where they'd incriminate themselves beyond any shadow of a doubt, but it would require Maisie's cooperation, and that worried me. She was still so fragile, still so hurt by Derek's betrayal. Could she handle pretending to be broken while we built our case? "She's stronger than you think," Marcus said, reading my expression. "Women who survive what she survived always are. The question is whether she's angry enough to see this through." I thought about my daughter, about the quiet fury that had replaced her tears over the past few days, about the way she'd methodically cataloged every piece of evidence we'd found, her face growing harder with each revelation. "She's angry enough," I said. "The question is whether I'm brave enough to ask her to do this." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were warm, familiar even after all these years. Glenda. What Derek did to Maisie, leaving her in that storm, stealing her inheritance, planning to collect on her life insurance. That wasn't just theft. That was attempted murder. If we don't stop him, he'll do it again to someone else's daughter. I knew he was right. Derek and Patricia weren't just criminals. They were predators who destroyed innocent women for sport. They'd already ruined too many lives, left too many victims in their wake. "When do we start?" I asked. "Tomorrow. But first we need to make sure Maisie is completely safe. I'm going to recommend she stay with you for the next few weeks. And I'm going to put a security system in your house. If Thornton realizes we're onto him before we're ready, things could get very dangerous very quickly." As we left the cafe, Marcus handed me a business card with only a phone number on it. "This is my private line. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me immediately, day or night. Marcus." I said as we reached our cars, "Why are you doing this after all these years? Why are you willing to help me?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the afternoon light. "Because 20 years ago, I failed someone I cared about. I let a bad man walk away, and innocent people paid the price." His expression hardened. "I won't make that mistake again." As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The thrill of going on the offensive. Derek thought he'd destroyed my daughter's life and gotten away with it. He thought we were helpless, defeated, too weak to fight back. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. 3 weeks later, everything was in place. Marcus had spent those weeks meticulously planning every detail of our operation. While Maisie had found a strength I didn't know she possessed, she'd thrown herself into the plan with a fierce determination that reminded me she was my daughter, and that meant she had steel in her spine when it mattered most. The trap we designed was elegantly simple. Through carefully orchestrated social media posts and strategic conversations with mutual acquaintances, we'd spread word that I was seriously ill and considering updating my will. The story was that I'd recently received a substantial inheritance from a distant relative, nearly $800,000, looking for ways to protect Maisie's future. Marcus had used his contacts to create a paper trail supporting this fiction. Bank records showing large deposits, medical records indicating a serious diagnosis, even fake legal documents discussing my estate planning. To anyone investigating it would look completely legitimate. The beauty of the plan was that Derek wouldn't be able to resist. He thought Maisie was broken, isolated, vulnerable. The chance to get his hands on that much money would override any caution he might have felt. On a Tuesday morning in early March, Derek finally took the bait. Maisie was staying at my house as she had been since the night of the storm. She was in the kitchen making coffee when her phone rang. We'd been expecting this call for days, but when it actually came, her face went pale. "It's him," she whispered, showing me the caller ID. I nodded encouragingly. We'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times. Maisie took a deep breath and answered, "Hello, Derek." Even from across the room, I could hear his voice through the phone. Smooth concerned, perfectly calibrated to sound like a man who'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to make amends. Maisie, sweetheart. I've been trying to work up the courage to call you for weeks. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Maisie's acting was flawless. Her voice trembled just the right amount, conveying hurt and uncertainty without seeming too eager. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Derek. What you did to me that night. I know. I was out of my mind with stress. The business has been struggling, and I took it out on you. It was the worst mistake of my life. The lie came so easily to him. There was no struggling business, just a carefully orchestrated theft that had been planned for years. But Derek was a professional, and professionals never broke character. I heard about your mother. He continued, his voice dropping to just the right tone of sympathy. I'm so sorry about her diagnosis. This must be such a difficult time for both of you. There it was, the hookweed dangled, and he'd grabbed it immediately. Maisie glanced at me, and I nodded. Time for the next phase. It's been hard, she admitted. Mom's trying to get her affairs in order, and it's all so overwhelming. I feel like I'm drowning Derek. You don't have to face this alone, sweetheart. I know I hurt you, but I want to help. I want to be there for you. The audacity of it took my breath away. This man who'd stolen everything from her, who'd left her to die in a blizzard, was now positioning himself as her savior. I don't know, Maisie said, her voice wavering convincingly. How do I know you won't hurt me again? Because I love you. I've spent every day since that night realizing what an idiot I was. Please just let me see you. Let me prove that I can be the husband you deserve. We'd predicted this would be his approach. Derek understood that direct manipulation wouldn't work. Maisie was too hurt, too suspicious. So he'd position himself as the repentant husband, hoping to slowly work his way back into her life and her finances. Maybe we could meet somewhere public, Maisie said hesitantly, just to talk. Of course, wherever you feel safe. I just want a chance to explain everything to show you that I'm committed to making this right. They arranged to meet at a restaurant downtown the following evening. After Maisie hung up, she sat down heavily at my kitchen table, her hands shaking. I almost believed him, she said quietly. Even knowing what I know, there was a part of me that wanted to believe he really was sorry. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. That's because you have a good heart, sweetheart. That's not a weakness. It's what makes you human. Derek counts on that goodness, exploits it. But this time we're going to use his assumptions against him. The next evening, Maisie met Derek at Antonelli's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. She wore a wire that Marcus had provided, and he had surveillance teams positioned throughout the restaurant. Every word Derek spoke would be recorded, every lie documented. I waited at home, pacing my living room like a caged animal. I'd wanted to be there to watch Derek's performance myself, but Marcus had insisted that my presence might spook him, so I waited, checking my phone every few minutes for updates. At 9:30, Maisie finally came home. Her face was pale but determined, and I could see the steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. How did it go? I asked. He's exactly as pathetic as we thought he'd be, she said, sitting down on the couch. He spent 2 hours telling me how sorry he was, how much he loved me, how he wanted to work things out. He even brought flowers. Did he mention the money? Not directly, but he kept talking about how we needed to think about our future, about making smart decisions with unexpected windfalls. He said he'd learned a lot about financial planning and wanted to help me navigate any complex situations that might come up. The arrogance was breathtaking. Derek actually thought he could con his way back into Maisie's life and steal my fictional inheritance. What did you tell him? That I needed time to think, but that I appreciated him reaching out? I played the part of the confused, lonely woman who just lost her mother's support. Maisie's smile was sharp and cold. He ate it up completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Perfect performance. Phase 2 tomorrow. Phase 2 involved Maisie agreeing to have Derek help her with my estate planning. She would tell him that I'd asked her to find a financial advisor who could help protect the inheritance from taxes and legal complications. Derek, of course, would volunteer his services, claiming he'd learned about these matters during his supposed business struggles. The genius of Marcus's plan was that it would force Derek to incriminate himself on multiple levels. To gain access to the fictional money he'd have to forge documents, create false financial instruments, and reveal the full scope of his criminal operation. Every step he took would be recorded, documented, and admissible in court. But the most beautiful part was what would happen when Derek realized he'd been caught. Marcus had tracked down 3 of Derek's previous victims, women whose lives he'd destroyed before moving on to Maisie. They were all prepared to testify to finally get their chance at justice. Derek thought he was walking into another easy score. Instead, he was walking into a trap that would finally end his reign of terror. As I watched Maisie prepare for the next phase of our operation, I felt a fierce pride in the woman she'd become. The scared, broken woman who'd collapsed in my doorway during the blizzard was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant fighting back. Derek had tried to destroy my daughter. Tomorrow, we would begin destroying him. The final confrontation came on a cold Friday morning in late March, exactly 2 months after Derek had abandoned Maisie in the storm. The irony wasn't lost on me. This man who'd used winter weather as a weapon was about to face his own blizzard of consequences. Derek had taken the bait completely. Over the past week, he'd presented Maisie with an elaborate financial plan for protecting my inheritance. The documents he'd created were masterpieces of fraud, fake investment accounts, forged legal documents, even a counterfeit power of attorney that would have given him complete control over the fictional $800,000. What Derek didn't know was that every meeting had been recorded, every document photographed, every conversation documented. Marcus had built an ironclad case that would send Derek to prison for decades. But I wanted more than justice. I wanted Derek to understand exactly what he'd lost, exactly what his greed had cost him. The meeting was scheduled for 10 hovering in the morning at Derek's office, a small suite he rented under his fake identity. Maisie arrived first, carrying a briefcase full of the fake documents Marcus had prepared. She looked calm, professional every inch. The grieving daughter trying to protect her inheritance. I waited in the parking lot with Marcus, watching through high-powered binoculars as Derek greeted Maisie with a smile that made my stomach turn. Even now, even while planning to steal from her again, he maintained his facade of caring. "FBI units are in position," Marcus said into his radio. "Local police standing by. As soon as he produces the forged power of attorney, we move." Through the window, I watched Derek spread his fraudulent documents across his desk, explaining to Maisie how they could protect my money from estate taxes and legal challenges. His performance was smooth, confident, completely convincing. No wonder he'd fooled so many women over the years. Then Maisie said the words we'd rehearsed. "This all looks wonderful, Derek, but I should probably tell you something first." Derek looked up from the papers, still smiling. "What's that, sweetheart?" "My mother isn't really sick, and there is no inheritance." The smile froze on Derek's face. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand what she'd said. Then slowly, the color drained from his cheeks. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but I could see the first flicker of panic in his eyes. "I'm talking about the fact that I know exactly who you are, David Thornton. I know about Patricia Hicks. I know about the house in Wisconsin and the forged signatures and the life insurance policy." Maisie's voice was steady, implacable. "I know everything." Derek shot to his feet, his mask finally slipping. "You're lying! You're confused, hurt, not thinking clearly. The way Linda Morrison was confused when you stole her pension. The way Sarah Chen was hurt when you emptied her savings account. The way Rebecca Walsh wasn't thinking clearly when you convinced her to sign over her house." Each name hit Derek like a physical blow. Those were his previous victims. Women whose lives he'd destroyed before moving on to Maisie. Women who were finally going to get their chance for justice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Derek said. But his voice was shaking now. "Those documents are legitimate financial instruments created with forged signatures and fake account numbers." Maisie interrupted. "Every single one of them." That's when Derek made his final mistake. Instead of trying to bluff his way out, instead of claiming ignorance or misunderstanding, he reached for the briefcase containing the original documents, the ones that would have given him access to my fictional money. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "This is for both of us. I was trying to help you by stealing from me, by leaving me to die in a blizzard, by planning to collect on my life insurance." Derek's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected her to know about that last part. "That's not— I never—" But the lies wouldn't come anymore. The smooth, practiced facade had cracked beyond repair. That's when the FBI agents burst through the door. "David Thornton, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder." The look on Derek's face as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists was everything I'd hoped it would be. Shock, disbelief, and finally the dawning realization that his carefully constructed world had just collapsed around him. But we weren't done yet. As Derek was being read his rights, another team of agents was simultaneously arresting Patricia Hendress at the house in Wisconsin. The house that Derek had bought with Maisie's inheritance money, the house where they'd planned their next con, was being searched from top to bottom. What the agents found there was even more damning than we'd expected. Patricia had kept meticulous records of all their previous scams, including detailed profiles of their victims and step-by-step plans for future cons. She'd treated the destruction of innocent women's lives like a business plan. Within hours, the full scope of their operation was exposed. 7 victims in 5 states, over $2 million stolen, and at least 3 cases where the women had been left in life-threatening situations when they'd gotten too close to the truth. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later when Derek tried to call Maisie from jail. She let it go to voicemail, then played the message for me. Derek's voice was different now, stripped of its practiced charm, raw with desperation. "Maisie, please, you have to listen to me. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you. I've always loved you." Patricia. She was the one with the plan. She forced me to go along with it. "Please, you have to believe me. You're the only good thing that ever happened to me." Even in jail, even facing decades in prison, Derek was still trying to manipulate her, still trying to position himself as the victim, the man who'd been led astray by a stronger, more evil woman. Maisie deleted the voicemail without listening to it again. 6 months later, Derek pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a 30-year sentence. Patricia, facing even more serious charges as the ringleader of their operation, was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. The money they'd stolen was recovered and returned to their victims. Maisie got back not just her inheritance, but every penny Derek had stolen from their joint accounts. The house in Wisconsin was sold, and the proceeds were distributed among the women whose lives Derek and Patricia had destroyed. But for me, the real victory wasn't financial. It was watching my daughter reclaim her strength, her confidence, her belief in her own worth. The scared, broken woman who'd collapsed in my doorway during that blizzard was gone forever. In her place stood someone who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to become the hunter. On the first anniversary of that terrible night, When Derek had abandoned her in the storm, Maisie and I drove out to the rest stop where it had all begun. The place looked different in daylight, smaller, more pathetic. It was hard to believe that this abandoned building had been the starting point for such a journey. I used to think that night was the worst thing that ever happened to me, Maisie said as we stood in the empty parking lot. But now I think it might have been the best thing. How so? Because it showed me who Derek really was, and it showed me who I really was too. She smiled, and there was no trace of the victim left in her expression. I'm stronger than I ever thought possible, Mom. And I have you to thank for that. As we drove home through the Minnesota countryside, I thought about the lessons this experience had taught us both. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us are the ones who hurt us most. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to fight for it. And sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting someone back. It's making sure they can never hurt anyone again. Derek thought he could destroy my daughter and walk away unscathed. He thought we were helpless, defeated, too weak to fight back. He learned too late that he'd made the biggest mistake of his criminal career. He'd underestimated the power of a mother's love and a daughter's courage, and that mistake had cost him everything. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.